Hi, everyone. So for our group design proposal, we did group therapy for adolescents with suicidal ideation who are in an active crisis. I'm Kaleigh Paccio.
And I'm Carolyn Gutierrez. So a little background and rationale for this group design. First and foremost, suicide, suicidal ideation, suicide attempts, all of it is still a taboo topic, whether we want to admit that or not. Not many people are comfortable talking about it. And additionally, clinicians aren't necessarily always equipped at handling suicidal patients who are either actively suicidal or have been in the past. Research and testimonials of being Baker acted has kind of led us to the belief that there isn't adequate interventions conducted to address patients with suicidal tendencies. Therefore, there isn't really anything in place to help these patients in a Baker Act facility that's truly therapeutic, so to speak. Receiving facilities often seek to stabilize the patient, but when you mix suicidal patients with patients who are homeless or under distress of drugs, psychotic episodes, the list goes on, this could actually be quite damaging to that individual, especially when the hold is so short and you're unleashing that person back into their environment with kind of almost a destabilizing effect.
So to bring in some literature just about how, crisis intervention should look. So the research that I found suggested that proper response in a crisis situation would be clearly immediate care for the patient and to assist in kind of laying out what the next steps are among them being discharged from this hold. Obviously, that includes making referrals to other mental health professionals who can continue to aid them in this healing process. We found that crisis care should involve three things, and that is evaluation and assessment, crisis intervention, and stabilizing the individual during the active crisis, and also follow-up planning. So not only with the patient, but also with their family so that they're on the same page. Some goals of crisis services include obviously that immediate intervention, involving the family, being open about that in terms of the treatment plan, trying to prevent future rehospitalization by stabilizing the crisis situation in the most appropriate setting, as Caroline said, not having other individuals who are under other circumstances of distress, as well as finally linking the patient and their family to additional support services upon being discharged. So a second source we looked into just basically went over how an involuntary psych hold can have, detrimental effects on the patient. First and foremost, they are in an active crisis. And so placing them on an involuntary hold can be disempowering and really place more stigma on the individual, especially since they are clearly struggling with some severe mental illness. Research shows that interventions in order to reduce these effects should address topics such as the stigma surrounding suicide in general, and also their emotional reactions. So loss of autonomy, not being able to choose for themselves based on the outcome. So also shame is accompanied with some of these feelings, being degraded, feeling exposed, leading to the patient feeling coerced, inferior, judged when they're involuntarily admitted. And this may undermine the individual's confidence and their ability to cope with such challenging emotions, which can, in the long run, lead to them being readmitted. So some objectives we thought out for a group that would look like an intervention for individuals who are on an involuntary hold based on being Baker acted. We want to provide a true and solid, stable kind of environment and also interventions that would help to de-escalate the current crisis. The purpose of providing this stability is so that the individual can learn healthy ways of coping, healthy ways of expressing themselves, and being able to respond when they're in distress in ways that are beneficial and do not bring them harm or pose threats to themselves while they are in an active crisis. We also want them to be able to seek support in others who may be a part of this group in order to kind of establish a preliminary support system, kind of make that sense of community. Also, investigating and being present in these tough feelings during an active crisis, just the processing alone can be really beneficial. And first and foremost, just creating a safe environment that doesn't exacerbate what the patient is currently feeling in an active crisis. I think this is you.
Okay, so composition of the group, selection criteria, logistics consider. Some of this is quite obvious. So the selection would be the suicidal adolescents, or that's a demographic we chose, was adolescents specifically, but the suicidal aspect is really where that selection criteria comes into play. And as we've mentioned before, those who are in a Baker Act facility or an involuntary setting. But we want to mention that this group design could totally be applicable to those in any type of intensive outpatient program. I think it would actually be great. A main consideration we had is people are really coming in and out of these facilities just based on the timeline itself. So it would be very hard to have a closed group dynamic where it's only a certain number of individuals for a certain number of days. So it would also be hard for this group to be extensive. Although, you know, if we wanted to apply this group design in an extensive way in an outpatient setting, I think it would be very beneficial. But since we're talking specifically to involuntary, it will have to be brief but intensive. Our idea is that it could operate 2 times daily at 2-hour intervals at that time. And that would be each day, starting with the day of entry to the day of dismissal. Another consideration is ensuring that patients upon entry to this program be verbally committed to attending individual therapy sessions following discharge in order to evaluate progress and effectiveness, because we would really love to know how this is operating in real time after the fact. You know, was this effective? Were they readmitted? What does that kind of look like? So it'd be great. It would be great to have those facts. So the framework for this type of group, we chose dialectical behavior therapy. This was created by Marsha Linehan. It is an evidence-based therapy. Just to kind of break down what this is, dialectical is synthesis of opposites. So it kind of is, it's integrating opposite emotions, opposite urges to kind of manage a crisis, so to speak. And behavior is, you know, the behavior aspect of DBT is approaching problematic behaviors in order for that patient to get out of a crisis faster and, you know, not be held in that state for longer than needed and advance toward behavioral goals. Evidence shows that implementing DBT specifically is effective in suicidality and PTSD. It was originally created for borderline personality, but it is really commonly used off-label now for suicidal patients based on some of the components that we'll go through. And, you know, lastly, I'll say the reason we chose it is to try to reduce suicidal thoughts and also readmission. And one statistic we found was DBT has been found to decrease the rate of suicide attempts by 50% in comparison to non-behavioral treatment by community experts. And that is from Marsha Linehan's organization themselves. That's where we found that statistic. So we kind of struggled with this idea of balancing processing content in such a tricky type of group design as we designed ourselves. This has never been created before, at least to our knowledge, at least to the research we've done. There was a huge gap. So this is a process group with directive components, as we're going to be, you know, doing certain exercises, walking through certain ideas, certain emotions, certain coping skills. But there has to be room for process to go on. We wish for each participant to begin to engage in processing what actions and emotions have led them to this point, to hospitalization. But that is not to be confused with doing any type of true trauma work. I shouldn't say true trauma work. I should say intensive trauma work in terms of like EMDR. I hope that wasn't confusing for anyone. We don't want to go to that point because, you know, this stage, they're in the early section of trying to heal. being in that involuntary hold. So our hopes is really intercepting further crisis while also preventing further suicide attempts by giving coping mechanisms. So we don't want to necessarily replace any EMDR that will have to go on after should that patient seek that. Sorry to go on that tangent, but maintaining appropriate content first starts with only admitting those who meet criteria. So this circles back to our whole point of, we do not want, for example, a non-suicidal schizophrenic patient or a homeless person who is withdrawing from drugs to be mixed into this group. It is not therapeutic, and it will also take this entire group off topic and ruin the whole process. So that's a huge one. Also, those who are just respectful to the process. I understand a lot of people that enter the Baker Act facilities, as Kaleigh mentioned, have a loss of autonomy. There's shame mixed in. There's anger, and we respect that. But if you're unable to be respectful in this group, it's going to ruin the process as well. So you'll be asked to leave. And participants will be given reframes of the topic or question should they kind of go or veer off topic to an extent. Obviously it's going to be an open process to an extent, but any large veering off will definitely be discouraged in just kind of reiterating what was stated. So this was also hard for us as well. Most suicidal patients, especially at that very onset time of hospitalization, they're either depressed or they're in a crisis state. They don't really want to be told or asked, what do you love doing, right? Because at that time, as we're taught in this program, many people will not have anything to answer. So my idea was to kind of warm up to the warm up and kind of just get everyone into a parasympathetic state and kind of ask everyone to just take 5 deep breaths in and 5 deep breaths out, which is also part of this DBT modality we want to use. It incorporates a bit of mindfulness and just to kind of get everyone in, hopefully on the same page of being willing to receive and open up. And in that warm up, I would want to explain, why we did that breathing technique. And I've kind of crafted out what we would say. So now that we've signaled to our body that we're safe, I want to do a small icebreaker. Food is universal, and we can all think of something that just tastes good to us. I would love if we could go around the room and name something we each find tasty. And if you feel comfortable sharing your name, that would be great too. I thought food was pretty non-charged and kind of a good way to open the group. So one of the things we want to do during this group we mentioned is exercises. One of the biggest tenets in DBT is mindfulness. Some of the tenets are kind of explaining what emotion mind versus rational mind versus wise mind. Emotion mind is, the impulsive one that will go and do the dangerous thing. Rational mind knows better, and the wise mind kind of is on a diagram, the complete middle that kind of weighs both pros and cons. And the idea is to kind of get a participant or a patient to really tap into that wise mind or higher self. Other aspects are observing thoughts, being mindful. If I have a disturbing thought, just simply observing it, describing it, but not judging it. It's this idea of sitting with it and not acting on it, if that makes sense. And finally, kind of participating in the moment after you have, labeled and observed consciously where you're at. And the goals of mindfulness are, kind of obvious, but to stay present and aware in painful emotions or urges. And this big idea of radical acceptance is a big one for DBT. It basically states, if I feel depressed or I feel angry, I radically accept myself now in this moment. And that's been a huge turning point for a lot of suicidal patients, is this radical acceptance of not only emotions, but self. Another tenet of DBT is just stress tolerance. Our idea here is to really give people that immediate coping that they need should they find themselves in painful emotions and, veering off into another crisis situation. So one of the things that Marshall Linhan created was this acronym called TIP. So it's temperature, intense exercise, pace, breathing, paired muscle relaxation. So these are just ways to get yourself in an immediate way out of a painful urge or emotion. One of the most beneficial from what I've read is this ice cube example. Patients have described a tremendous success with simply placing ice cubes in either hand when maybe a suicidal ideation or a painful urge comes up. The temperature alone tends to bring people back into this parasympathetic response. And it actually acts as a great distraction as well. So that's something to note, that just giving people this knowledge, I think, could serve them long term, should they remember it in an active crisis. And the goal of distress tolerance is, as we said, to distract from the uncomfortable and to bring awareness back to the moment itself. Okay, I am feeling this way, but I don't have to necessarily act on it. And how I feel is okay. I'm allowed to feel this way, but I don't need to act on this. And that emotions really are, they're a wave that come in and out. And that's a big part of DBT as well. And some of the closure, it's quite hard to do closure in an open group like this, especially in a brief group, especially in a group that's transient. People are coming in and out. But some things we crafted were, as it closes, for maybe that specific group of individuals that came at a certain time, whatever it may be, kind of asking the group, I want us to think of one thing, big or small, that we can declare here and now, that we radically accept about what has brought each of us to this point. Where can you radically accept yourself up to this point? And so me, in my own life, I kind of came up with, maybe offering my own radical acceptance and saying, I will start, I radically accept that I will go through bouts of depression during my life, and I radically accept myself as I acknowledge something that is painful. So I think that could be helpful for others to know, that, everyone can radically accept something that's, as our cohort loves to say, our shadow. So.
So getting into some leadership role and functions. As a leader, as we've all been practicing, it is so important to encourage members of the group to participate. But in this kind of setting, when individuals are fresh in an active crisis, it wouldn't be good to really force that. And some individuals may benefit just from simply being present, and having other people around them and kind of feeling like they're not alone in this process. So but by encouraging others to share if they are comfortable, and it can help to kind of get rid of that feeling of isolation and help to validate the feelings that are being felt in such a time of crisis. This can establish a sense of community. As the leader, we also want to invite constructing healthy coping behaviors, and what to do if a similar situation were to arise at some point in the future. It is good to be able to bounce ideas off of other individuals who are experiencing something similar in the present time. So maybe there are some individuals who are in tune with what they know works for them to de-escalate, what they know doesn't work for them, and it can be easier to devise a plan in that state. Some members may have not been through a situation like this, and it can be super helpful to get support. And also, the group leader has a big responsibility of emphasizing the importance of confidentiality at every session, given that this is an open group. So to kind of walk through what we think might look like an example session if this were to be executed. So the goal here is to process the suicidal tendencies for which the patient was initially placed on the involuntary hold, and also to find tools to better equip with coping and kind of processing these strong emotions that are being felt during a time of crisis. Some objectives here would be to investigate these feelings and why they are present, to become conscious of unhealthy thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that may have been felt in the past or present, and to also seek support in others if comfortable, in order to create kind of a sense of community and limit that feeling of isolation that can be easily felt while in involuntary hold. So the outcomes, we hope to provide a safe and supportive environment for patients, also promoting these social skills and communicating about their feelings with themselves and others, and instilling that accountability for what one is feeling at the present time. So some possible activities could be an icebreaker, like Caroline mentioned, something neutral, not necessarily, what makes you happy or what name a time when you're sad, but maybe more so talking about food or something that kind of has neutral ground, but that allows group members to open up to one another to kind of start establishing that trust, which is hard to gather, especially considering that is an open group. So another activity could be a processing activity in order to pinpoint the feelings that are currently being felt, the degree to which they're felt, where in the body they're felt, what color they would be. So just kind of really being present in what feelings are being felt and kind of learning how to process those feelings, especially in a time of crisis. And some potential homework is offering a journal prompt to continue to work on after they're discharged from the hold, or even until the next session if it's the beginning of their hold. And so that's for the purpose of being intentional about what they're feeling during this process. So some example processing questions might look like, what do you need from this group and how can you get it in the brief amount of time? What is your idea of progress and where do you see yourself a year from now? Again, instilling that kind of sense of hope, which can be hard at a time of crisis. But again, we're trying to stray away from these tough feelings and kind of be present and knowing that there's more to come. Um, Also asking how they're feeling at this point in time. It can be really super hard to pinpoint a specific emotion, but really trying to resonate with that feeling. Asking who is someone that you can trust when you're feeling these strong feelings and becoming overwhelmed with processing them on your own. And also asking what are some healthy ways that we can handle an influx of these difficult feelings. So our idea for the time needed to achieve the goal of this group is that sessions would occur ideally twice per day during the duration of the involuntary hold, which is typically in the state of Florida, 72 hours. And so after that 72 hours among discharge, the patient will hopefully have had the opportunity to at least process the situation and to start investigating some coping skills that would be relevant to their healing journey. So in terms of some evaluation components, so for termination and follow-up, termination will obviously occur once the involuntary hold is up after those 72 hours. And we will assume that the client has accepted upon entry that they will be, followed up on a monthly basis for up to 6 months following discharge, just to make sure that everything is making progress. And some provisions for the lack of progress or harm that could result from this group is that clients entering the program must sign a waiver of personal responsibility as well as a document of informed consent so that they know that what's going on here, what the goals are, just so that nobody's left in the dark. Informed consent will outline what an example session would look like, what is expected from them as a group member and as a group as a whole, and also their right to confidentiality within the group, and also when they leave the group. So client will agree to use a crisis plan or coping skills as constructed during the group sessions. So some research questions that we came up with are, if an adolescent is subject to our suicide prevention therapeutic intervention group, will the rate of rehospitalization decrease compared to those who do not receive this treatment? So in order to try to answer this question, we predict obtaining records from participating hospitals, and that will help us indicate whether patients included in these said group interventions were readmitted under the same involuntary hold within a specific time restraint following the group that was run during their initial hold. A second question that we came up with is, if this type of group was to be implemented on adolescents with suicidal ideation, but that had not attempted suicide yet, will the rate of actual attempted suicide decrease as well as initial hospitalization? So this kind of gets fuzzy in trying to answer this kind of question because it can be invasive in terms of confidentiality. But ideally, we would like to collect a record of a caseload from a therapist of individuals who have expressed suicidal tendencies to operationalize this idea, verbalizing that they have a set plan, rumination of suicidal thoughts, access to means to execute a plan, things like that. And collaborating with nearby hospitals to account for these same individuals and whether or not they have been placed on an involuntary hold, otherwise known as Baker acted. And these are our references, and thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening. And if anyone's interested in DBT and learning more about it, the Marshall and Hand Institute, the Behavioral Tech Institute, is really a great resource. Thank you guys for listening.